Good evening. This is Mae Brussell. The title of the program is World Watchers. It's broadcast number 762, July the 14th, 1986. I want to continue along the lines of the health problems, the genetic testing, the AIDS, the combination of experimentation on AIDS up in the shuttle program with the combination of William Graham of NASA becoming the science advisor to the president, working closely with Lawrence Bogard of the Advanced Genetic Sciences that wants to do the genetically altered bacteria on live bacteria on plants, specifically starting in Monterey County, the first place in the world they were going to put them. And I want to go along those lines because part of it is after the 4th of July celebration and all the great patriotism and the show of flags and the bands and everything, which was so nauseating. Simultaneously, while that was going on, I was separating articles on all of the dangers that are around us in the society once these worn, tired people from oppression come to our shores and we let them in. What do they receive when they get here, and what share of this pie are they going to get in terms of health and welfare, and what is happening to all of us combined that is something totally contradictory to the image that Ronald Reagan has of being so strong and pure and altruistic to all kinds of people, to be so free and so full of joy. There's something else going on in this world, the manufacturing of weapons and the destruction of the planet, that is totally contradictory to the image that he wants to give, just as the beautiful pictures of Hitler and Mussolini talking to the adoring masses as he's going to lead them into a point of destruction for them and for their countries, or at least for what Hitler's purposes, what he was doing at the time, to retrench later. But certainly Germany has suffered from what the consequences of following him and believing every word he said up to that point. Now, along the lines of the herbicides, I mentioned last week the soldiers that were taken sick because they were on some programs out in the field and didn't know that they had been sprayed with herbicides. There was an article in the San Francisco Chronicle just a couple of weeks ago, Risk of Herbicides in National Forests. Workers, visitors, and neighbors of California's federal forest land could face a variety of health risks. The Forest Service is resuming its use of herbicides. The 265-page study was commissioned by the Forest Service to examine the health and safety dangers posed by 13 herbicides that resulted from federal court rulings in 3 Oregon cases. At least 4 of 13 herbicides are listed as possible carcinogenics. The report found that the greatest threat from them could be faced by workers who apply chemicals from the ground or helicopters. The worst case, women workers who bear children would have birth defects. There's a risk that newborns would have under-average weights. Other potential risks from the spraying includes loss of appetite, upset stomach, adverse reproductive effects, and the study shows that there's a lifetime risk of workers who are dying that's quite low now, but could be escalated later if they are subject to more of the insecticides or pesticides. In extreme cases, people living or hiking in the vicinity of the areas could suffer reproductive problems, experience birth defects. There is danger in the drifting of this spray in contaminated berries. The use of herbicides in California forests was suspended after the Oregon cases in 1983 were decided. The suspension was later expanded to the whole nation. Controversial chemicals have been used to clear thousands of acres of brush, to prepare sites for reforestation, kill unwanted vegetation, so commercial trees would grow faster. The new Forest Service study comes at extremely critical time after a battle over spraying herbicides in California and other western states. The agency is now in the process of draft management plans for its 20 million acres in California, 170 million acres elsewhere, and they warn about the widespread dangers as a result of the herbicides that they're using to clear out particular areas. There's 18 national forests they're referring to. The public review period for the herbicide document ends August the 11th. Responses can be sent to the U.S. Forest Service, and it gives the address and their meetings. The meetings took place in June. There'll be some more public hearings in July in Sacramento, Eureka, and Redding about that factor. Another article, General Accounting Office says public goes uninformed of long-term risks from pesticides, and it tells about the chemical laws that the EPA had and assessed for health risks under a 1972 law, but the registration is not working adequately, and that there are long-term health effects, and owners and weekend gardeners get little information on the health of themselves due to the pesticides they're spraying into their gardens. Citizens who walk on lawns, go into public buildings every day without knowing those areas have been treated with pesticides. They're not informed. The public isn't told the uncertainties surrounding chronic health risks, so you have parks and forests and public buildings and grass that are sprayed with these chemicals. They're asking for re-registration of chemicals, data on the exposure, and the date that would alter the date for altering their techniques, when they would change their techniques. And they also want people to be aware that there's pesticides used in public places, schools, restaurants, hotels, offices, industrial workplaces, park, and golf courses. Another article, May 29th, bacteria contaminated lake closed in Contra Costa County. It draws more than 5,000 visitors on summer weekends, and because of bacteria there, contamination 10 times higher than normal, they were forced to close it. Another article about advanced genetic sciences trying to use their live bacteria in it's called Tucalaque Lake. It's in Modoc County in California. There's been a temporary stop on them doing it, but they have it's a go-ahead pretty soon to begin using experiments on potato plants up at Tucalaque Lake, and the University of California has delayed their genetically engineered bacteria in the Northern California field until next fall, and the people involved with that experiment are involved with AGS, and the EPA has temporarily stopped them from putting the genetically altered bacteria into the open field, but it will probably be done in the fall. They're waiting to do it in the fall. Another large article was in the New York Times. Florida big pig farm poses AIDS riddle. And this is about persons looking for the causes of AIDS in Belle Glade. That's a predominantly black community with a large Nazi entourage around the black area, where they have an unusually high incidence of AIDS among their poor population. There's 50 confirmed cases of AIDS in this area. And in the process of looking for the environment that could cause it, they came across pigs that have swine flu, and they believe that the virus is similar, or seems similar, to the symptoms and the conditions of Belle Glade. They haven't made a direct connection of swine fever, rather, and the Belle Glade, the pigs that were fed to the undernourished people, the blacks in Belle Glade, from the swine flu who have AIDS. And there is a lot of controversy about the experiments there. This is a long article, and I'll go into it later, but preliminary studies, according to this, have failed to establish the link between AIDS and the groups. It says the AIDS victims and major groups known to be the highest risk of getting the disease. Male homosexuals, intravenous drug abusers, hemophiliacs, and so forth are not part of this Belle Glade group that have AIDS, so they're trying to find out why they have it. And in the process of looking for causes, they found pigs stricken with chronic African swine fever, and victims have almost common characteristics, such as large lymph nodes, skin lesions, immune-related pneumonia, reduction of white blood cells, and so forth. So that an area where the blacks are having a large number of AIDS, they're also being fed from the diseased swine that are unusual in this country, if not the first ones found here, and that food is being sold to those poor people down there in Belle Glade. Another article, U.S. delays test of gene-altered pesticide. They first gave the go-ahead on the Monsanto company, and I had that on the air a while back. Then they said you better wait at least until next year until it's tested, that the field test of the genetically engineered bacteria should be delayed. It's a red light, then it's a green light, and this will go for corn plants. And this involves the Pseudomonas fluorescens, the same thing that is involved with advanced genetic sciences, and the intention to spray Monterey County strawberry fields with that live altered bacteria. Monsanto has been told wait a while, and then after they were told that, they found out they'd already tested it in some areas, but right now it is on a hold while they go back and go over some of the material to maybe study the consequences, the full consequences of what would happen. Another article in the Boston Globe last April, altered virus test is called illegal. This says that on the eve of congressional hearings on the supervision of biotechnology industry with charges of illegal field tests, genetically engineered organisms are being exposed, and this has to do with the one that I referred to last week, the test in Houston, Texas, or outside of Texas, of the swine disease on the pigs, and Dr. Salkit of Baylor and the Texas A&M and the scientists directly linked to the companies that manufacture the genetically engineered viruses. This was called illegal and suspended, although they had been doing it for 2 years. Another editorial, this is from the New York Times, FDA's game of genetic roulette. And this is about the fact how dangerous it could be that people are worrying about Chernobyl and 3 Mile Island, but they're not worrying about the Food and Drug Administration, that the radiation is admittedly would deplete vitamins and minerals in food, and our government wants to use radiation on these particular food subjects, and they're saying that it's no more than if you just cook the food, you'd lose that nutrition. But this article is about eating irradiated food and the dangers, the possible amounts of radioactive material, and the event there's an accident, there's a risk of catastrophic release of radiation in large areas of permanently uninhabitable land as a result of radiation. And this article says, since the dose of radiation that will be used on foods is 200 times the lethal exposure for human beings, workers will be at risk of immediate death from radiation sickness should they be exposed. If a worker opens the wrong door, as did one in 1977 at Radiation Technologies New Jersey plant, after the management had disconnected a safety lock, he would receive a lethal dose in less than a minute. The Nuclear Regulatory Committee did not follow up the case. We do not know whether this worker survived or not. Proponents of food irradiation predict that 1,000 plants could be operated by the end of the century using billions of curies of radiation a year so that the food coming to us would be radiated. Incidentally, I got a sheet from the the Conservative Caucus. Howard Phillips is the chairman, and the title over the Conservative Caucus leaflet is Americans Against AIDS. And again, the immune system could be tampered with through these live altered bacteria if you have a weak immune system. So there is a relationship between immune system and breaking down the immune system, known as AIDS, and also in food products. Now, the Congressional Advisory Board for Americans Against AIDS has United States Senator Stephen Sims from Idaho. He's a very close worker with Lamar Bunker Hunt, the H.L. Hunt family in Texas, and also that family closely linked to Allen and John Foster Dulles. And Sims is part of the Congressional Advisory Board. U.S. Senator Jesse Helms is another one. Representative Dana Meyer is another member. But one of the people whose name they have on the list against AIDS is Honorable Larry McDonald. He died in 1983, and it's 1986, and the brochure requesting money to attack those people who have the disease AIDS and to make new laws, felonies against people with AIDS for various charges and so forth, uses the Honorable Larry McDonald on the literature as a person who, even though he's dead, would be against people with AIDS, so therefore you can respect his name is on the Conservative Caucus as being concerned about AIDS even in his grave. Another article, DDT-bearing pesticide approved. Dicofol, D-I-C-O-F-O-L, is the first authorized since the ban 14 years ago. Reagan is taking away the ban on the use of a pesticide containing DDT, a powerful insecticide. Now, it was stopped 14 years ago because it was a danger to trees and living substances and was put on the back burner since 1972. Why does the Reagan administration let it out? Why do they want all this in the air? I can't even figure why they would want it, and the people they deal with get the effects of it. Why are they loosening all of this up at this time and releasing it on the animals and the humans who have to go back in time where the lid was put on there and go back to the time where they could just about spray anything they wanted? Another article, Ex-Cancer Society aide indicted for $4 million fraud. This is from New York City, and a former American cancer fundraiser. So money to fight and study these diseases also goes in the private hands of people who use it for their own particular purposes. Another story, East Bay anger over radioactive shipment out in California at the port of Oakland. They were shipping radioactive material that was not supposed to be sent through the regular channels and streets. Fort shipments of highly radioactive spent nuclear fuel entered the Oakland port since 1980. They were trucked to General Electric Nuclear Research in Sunol, and they made a resolution last month that all shipments of spent nuclear fuel into or out of the port of Oakland, in response to the U.S. Department of Energy proposal, should be stopped, and they don't want an entry for shipments from Taiwan. Now, Taiwan is sending us their old, tired, very dangerous radioactive fuel to the United States. They don't keep it on their soil, but they're sending us that fuel, and the spent fuel is shipped to the GE labs. It was irradiated in Norway, and millions of times more radioactive than levels are considered safe. It was sent in California along Highway 17 that winds and turns and goes through Santa Cruz, and is a very beautiful highway, and transported up, actually on the northern part of Highway 17 that goes above Richmond and that area up on the peninsula. But they transport this fuel, which is described as one of the most dangerous freeways in California Highway 17, as having this kind of fuel on this route and being sent here from other countries to the United States. Another article just this last month in May, 2 months ago now already, Army citing health hazard impounds field rations. 6.7 million of combat field rations was impounded and thrown away, 6.7, because the containment in the packets, there was a hole in the rations, and they weren't sure what kind of danger would happen to the food substance, so the combat field rations were pulled back. The action was taken after inspectors found tiny holes in plastic food pouches and decided that these ready-to-eat meals could be dangerous. So even soldiers and people in the forest and vacationers are playing golf and so forth. You get a combination of articles, and I have many, many more, that you come to the conclusion that almost nothing is safe around us. And alongside of that, there was an article, Doctors in Uruguay Linked to Torture, and it tells about them altering autopsy reports, watching torture until they're at the point of death so that they tell them it was safe to pull back, and lying about the causes of death, using using doctors for all kinds of interrogation and physical conditions. Now, this is similar to Nazi Germany, and the reason I cite that is that the doctors working on these cancer experiments could have the same mindset of what is safe or not safe as military doctors in Uruguay, who played a significant role with the military dictatorships, went side by side with the troops, and they detained up to 40,000 people, saw many tortures, put their heads in filthy water, and so forth. But the doctors aren't necessarily separated from experiments, and experiments could be danger, just as torture was danger, and the medical establishment can be as much a part of the brave new world, and is, and we think of them as protecting us or protecting our food or our forest or our trees, where actually they could be part of the problem and are in making possible genocide and elimination of a large segment of the earth through these biological phenomena. Now, David Emory from up north, he's on KFJC and KKUP, and a fellow listener to his program sent him an article which he sent to me, is two articles actually, which really are very, very important. The first was October 19th, 1971, titled Nixon Counts on Conversion of Military Facilities. And the time period is very important because I want to get to this article, then get back to Tom Pappas and SPIRO AGNEW and the Greek military junta and CIA that were behind Agnew's vice presidency under Nixon, because keep in mind that even though Nixon was president, there was Agnew as a fallback, and he was working closely with dictatorships that were using torture and various mistreatment of human beings, and he was sitting there as our vice president under Richard Nixon. Now, the article is about Richard Nixon's conversion of military facilities at Fort Detrick, Maryland. This was written in 1971, and just last week there was an article that the military never did get rid of their bacteriological chemical warfare, but for all purposes, it made Nixon look, I say Reagan, it made Nixon look like he's altruistic, like he's giving up the evil thought of having laboratories that would have bacteriological or chemical warfare. The article talks about Nixon's hope as the nation moved from wartime to peacetime era. His hope was to convert many military facilities to meet pressing domestic challenges. Now, that is a giveaway right there, because in 1971, he didn't move from wartime to peacetime era. We never stopped our wartime goals, that is for sure. But he was worried, and the people around him were worried, as evidence of the COINTEL program, the Operation Chaos, the use of the CIA, the National Security Agency, the FBI, for destroying the American milieu right home domestically. The war became at home, and this article says he was meeting pressing domestic challenges, which were actually equal to his overseas war because of the objection to the war. The article again says, Nixon counts on conversion of military facilities. Nixon's hope as the nation moved from wartime to peacetime era was to convert many military facilities to pressing domestic challenges. The president said, cutbacks in defense needs have provided a considerable supply of expertise and equipment that can now be used for non-defense purposes. Now, he calls defense as if we were attacked. We weren't attacked by Vietnam or Laos or Cambodia or the Soviet Union or China. Defense was always an attack. But what he was doing, and now the history books show loud and clear, they were making an offensive weapon against us, people of the United States, and could say, now we have the funds and facilities because we're cutting back on our defense. We hadn't even done the Cambodia bombings, and our warfare state was hardly over. And he made it sound like we have this extra money, the war is winding down. Now, the challenge at the time when he was president was too many protesters, overpopulation, the strikes of Cesar Chavez with the farm workers, United Prisoners Union with Popeye Jackson, and the domestic challenges that he talks about were set up by the FBI, as I say, and Tom Charles Houston of Young Americans for Freedom with the military, for things called Operation Chaos, to turn families against each other, to turn children against their parents, couples against each other, and the MK-Ultra program, which was mind experiments and drug experiments, again with Alan Foster and John Foster Dulles. They instigated these, and using all of the intelligence agencies for domestic problems. And the World Almanac, the reason I found that medical genetic reference that I used last week was I looked up in the World Almanac what was happening in 1971 when Nixon said we could cut back in defense and now use for non-defense purposes for pressing domestic challenges. Well, the World Almanac of 1971, describing the events of 1970, goes into the May Day demonstration in Washington, D.C., the one that ired SPIRO, AGNEW, and John Mitchell so much, 250,000 protesters, the three-day march from the Capitol to Arlington, the rallies in San Francisco, among other places that had from 60 to 170,000 people, the $20 billion that was given a riot panel for domestic operations. In those days, in 1970, the Pentagon spent and put up $20 billion for a riot panel. And Agnew attacking the press. The Indians occupied Alcatraz, 89 Indians during 1970. The Army was charged with two My Lai massacres. Two of the people in the My Lai massacres, rather, were charged for the crimes that killed at least 109 women and children. It was the first draft lottery since World War II. It started September 14th, 1970. The Chicago Panther shootout took place. It involved the FBI and our domestic intelligence, where Fred Hampton and Mark Clark were killed. They were in bed, two black people, and the police came in and gunned them down. There were shootouts in Los Angeles with the Panthers and in San Francisco. There was the cult murder indictment of Charles Manson, a neo-Nazi with Tex Watson from Texas, the Eagle Scout, and the do-gooder meeting with Beverly Hills lawyers before they went into the Sharon Tate home. The Mary Jo Kopechne autopsy was denied in 1970. There was a request to exhume the body and see if there were poisons in her. That was turned down. Harvard suspended 75 of its black students because of demonstrations against the way black histories were taught. Joseph Yablonsky, the United Mine Worker, was killed. He was 59 years old. The labor leader for the United Mine Workers, the official, his wife and daughter were gunned down. There was a Chicago 7 trial in Chicago where these 7 individuals were charged with traveling for the purpose of causing a riot. And Sherman Skolnick always said that they were CIA-related in order to get these laws on the board so that people couldn't cross lines or could always be subject to be arrested because of that. There were black protests at Amherst University from 5 different colleges meeting. I'm citing what was happening in 1970 because the 71 Almanac said that these events, these social events, were just a few of the activities of 1970. And in 1971, Richard Nixon is saying, we're going to use our military facilities to meet pressing domestic changes, which is in fact what could happen. As I say, there's a long list of things that were happening. The New York townhouse was bombed. The weathermen were charged and 3 were killed. At Kent State, Ohio, 4 students were killed and others were shot. At Jackson State, 2 students were killed and 10 were wounded. And the report on that said that the killings were unwarranted, unnecessary. The police were involved with that, as was Interior Secretary Walter Hickel, who asked Vice President Agnew to stop attacking the youth in his talks. Admiral Thomas Moore became Chief of Naval Operations. He took over off as Chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff, and he then was on the board of Western Goals with Edward Teller and Larry McDonald, the opponent of AIDS, Teller the father of the hydrogen bomb and the Star War lasers and so forth. And Moore was part of Western Goals with Larry McDonald and a team of Who's Who, a military intelligence group with computers into police departments. There were racial riots. It had been 1.5 years since the murder of Reverend Martin Luther King, and Whitney Young and the Teamsters Union took over from Cesar Chavez in California, the head of the AFL-CIO, that was replaced by Teamsters, and farm strikes and activity were over. There was the shootout of Judge Haley in Marin County that preceded the San Quentin 6 shootout where Jonathan Jackson was murdered, the brother of George Jackson. There was the FBI arrest of a Jesuit priest, Reverend Daniel Berrigan. You remember that? And Agnew was touring around the country talking about the radicalibs, the whimpering isolationism, the mullish obstructionism and domestic policy, the pusillanimous pussyfooting on law and order, and he was mouthing those words and referring to the radical liberals as troglodyte. I can't even pronounce it. Troglodytic, T-R-O-G, troglot, L-O-D, troglodytic, leftist. That was a word that Agnew preferred to use. And articles, Nixon decries spreading violence, spreading disease of violence as a political tactic. And he referred to the disease of violence at a time when these laboratories were being converted to domestic needs. And as the next article that David sent to me from a listener goes on to say, the medical labs for studying cancer and disease right in the same offices as the biological and germ warfare were to go to Litton Industry, the corporation, the front under Roy Ashe and Tex Thornton for the military Greek dictatorship that was put into power, that was used as part of our coups and was an offshoot of the Howard Hughes empire. They took $43 million off the top and formed their own company and then began to use that money for coups and then were to go into medical experiments, which I'll explain in a few minutes. But just to get a tone of the unrest that was happening, Salvador Allende Gossens, a physician, had been elected president in Chile and was ordered immediately to be done away with by Henry Kissinger and the national security agencies. And in 1970, Monterey pop star Janis Joplin was dead. This was a year after Woodstock and Altamont, where a person was murdered right on the camera while the Rolling Stones were singing about John Kennedy. Louis Lomax was killed that year on a way to New Orleans. He was working on the murder of Reverend Martin Luther King and was to go to the Trade Mart to meet people, and the Trade Mart was the center of activities that were behind the murder of John Kennedy and Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy. And Major General Rene Schneider in Chile was murdered in 1970. That preceded the Allende murder, a close friend of Allende. So during these years, there was all this turmoil when Richard Nixon is going to get very altruistic and build his laboratory. Now, Nixon says in the New York Times article, October the 19th, 1971, we can help advance important public goals even as we alleviate the economic burdens which threaten idle workers and their family. The president didn't specify how using defense-related facilities could be converted to civilian projects. You bet he didn't, and the reason I give you the milieu is to get the tone. I just about the end of this half hour, so I'd take a 1-minute break and go back to the New York Times article of Nixon converting a military facility when in fact he's actually declaring war in the United States and converting it to what becomes a domestic weapon and proves to be a domestic weapon and not anything altruistic at all. This is Mae Brussell. It's the second half of broadcast number 762, July 14th, 1986. The article I'm citing is New York Times, October 19th, 1971. Nixon counts on conversion of military facilities. Continuing with this article, it says Nixon announced that the germ warfare facilities, Fort Detrick, Maryland, one of the nation's largest research and development facilities for biological weapons, would be converted into a major center for cancer research. And keep in mind as you read, or I hope you read or have seen, books about Senator Frank Church's investigations into biological warfare, into MK-Ultra program, into the Pentagon's Operation Chaos and COINTEL program, that cancer should have been the last thing, except on the books, of concern to Richard Nixon, who was really clashing with his society, fighting this society, and that the most pressing thing was how to handle these masses of people. It was war at home. Cancer wasn't the disease, but the people was the disease. He refers to them as a disease. The article says the conversion of the base to peacetime medical research was urged by Senator Mathias of Maryland, his home state, and Maryland's other representative, Senator Glenn Beall, intensified the efforts for this project. He wanted a cure for cancer. He asked Congress for an additional $100 million for the project. Now that goes back to 1971, putting $100 million into the hands of people like Richard Nixon and SPIRO AGNEW for the working or the development of cancer. And I've never heard from Senator Beall, Glenn Beall, I don't know where he is, that he was so interested in getting $100 million for a building or a facility to be put next to the biological germ warfare still at Fort Detrick. And according to this article, 7 buildings out of the 1,230-acre base were filled with millions of dollars worth of sophisticated equipment for biological research that could be converted. The facilities will employ more than 600 persons. It could cost between $15 and $20 million to operate. The management of the actual research will be subcontracted to a private concern. Now, this first article mentions the private concern and doesn't say that it is Litton Industry, but that comes next. The facilities could be designed to serve as a medical center for cancer research now being conducted across the country by private scientists. A cancer cure program will be reported directly to the president himself. President Nixon asked for an extra $100 million because of the senator's request. He got the Senate approval July the 7th, 1971. Now, interestingly enough, the people that opposed Richard Nixon or could expose his role, say, in the Kennedy assassination or in these activities, those people died of cancer, such as Jack Ruby and Martha Mitchell and I think of Senator Frank Church and Hubert Humphrey. The Frank Church investigating this, Hubert Humphrey, who ran as a Democrat against Nixon in 1968, who wanted the full employment, the Humphrey-Hawkins bill of full employment. He died of cancer, and Senator Chavez just died of one of those excruciating Lou Gehrig diseases, which is similar to the swine flu symptoms, the shot after swine flu, the paralysis, and so forth. The so-called liberals or the important witnesses, Martha Mitchell, not a witness, not a liberal, but a witness to the Watergate effect and to Richard Nixon's role and other people's role, and cancer can be used as a weapon. I've long said that, but their concern now is to get a cancer approval experiment going. July 7, 1971, they had $100 million. A bill was approved to preserve the National Cancer Institute within the National Institute of Health rather than have a new agency. So all of them work together and remain separate but together and continued with their adventures. Now, the next article that David had that was sent to him from a listener is titled "LITTON to Run Cancer Research Lab." And this article came from the New York Times, June 25th, 1972. The National Cancer Institute named a contractor to operate its newly acquired facilities at Fort Detrick, Maryland. The National Cancer Institute. The former biological warfare laboratories would be fully at work towards the conquest of cancer. The Department of War, you remember, after World War II became the Department of Defense, and now biological and chemical warfare becomes a research center for solving, turning it from a biological warfare laboratory into a cancer research lab. The article says the contract for renovation management and operation for the facilities goes to Litton Bionetics, a division of Litton Industry. As I say, in 1967-68, Litton was a conduit, one of the main conduits for the CIA to put in the Greek fascist military coup. Spiro Agnew, the vice president, with Richard Nixon, and Nixon only got the nomination on the condition he take Agnew as his vice president, had close links to Tom Papas and the Greek junta, and I'll go back to the material that was in Nation magazine and discuss some more details of that with you. And the third thing, as I say, is that Litton was an offshoot of Hughes Aircraft, taking $43 million, an overdraft from the aircraft and forming their own company. Now, Hughes Corporation, Howard Hughes, was one of the main factors putting Nixon into the House of Representatives in 1946 to defeat Jerry Voorhees, who was fighting the control of IG Farben and trying to break up the combine of IG Farben, the very company involved with J. Peter Grace and Allen and John Foster Dulles, and connecting links to people working in AGS right now, Advanced Genetic Sciences. And so that Howard Hughes and Richard Nixon's career, and the Hughes Medical Institute is putting billions of dollars, $5 billion this year, into experiments on AIDS and the immune system and cancer also. And yet the mentality of the people running these things is purely racist, genocidal, and antisocial in terms of preserving or doing anything positive or noticeable that anybody yet can see. The article says the first-year contract is for $6 million. Dr. Frank Rauscher, the director of the Cancer Institute, will get it, the money. The money is awarded by the National Institute of Health, and they will work with their cancer viruses. They will study the chemicals capable of causing cancer. Those chemicals that are capable of causing cancer, as I've cited in this broadcast and the week before, are in trees, they're in farms, they're in grass, they're in the food you eat, and allegedly they were set up with this $100 million by the taxpayers like us, to protect us. But in finding the causes and the chemicals capable of causing cancer, they're escalating the use of them and they're releasing the controls on them. So what is the purpose of this group in the first place? The article continues, viruses and special biological materials will be produced in large quantities, viruses, for use not only at Fort Detrick, but at other laboratories doing cancer research also. 30,000 animals will be studied by the end of the second year. They will be only part of the animal population. Litton will have no guaranteed profit from the experiment. In other words, they are the cover for it. However, if the government finds the company's progress warrants it, Litton will be permitted profit up to 10%. And in the case in Texas, Texas A&M and Baylor would get 50% of the result of experiments by the very scientists working on it. So the front money is put up by the taxpayers, like the $100 million in this case, but if something comes of it, they can get the profit. The profit doesn't go back to the people paying their taxes as paying for itself, the original project. The people doing it get the extra profit. The article continues, this operation is expected in future years to reach a legal level as high as $20 million a year. So we pay the taxes, put up the front money. If it doesn't work, they don't find the causes of cancer, we've lost the money, the taxpayers, they haven't. But if it turns out to work, then they can go into business and make up to $20 million a year. Bionetics, a division of Litton Industries, this is the New York Times, since 1968, has been active as a commercial research laboratory since 1961. Division of Litton Industry and the laboratory, and the way it's written in the New York Times, It's a little confusing, but the commercial research laboratory has been going since 1961. The 1960 was the year that Robert Mayu from the CIA, working under Howard Hughes, hired John Rosselli and Sam Giancana and various people from organized crime and the Central Intelligence Agency to set up assassination teams and squads. And in 1961, Litton Industry was active in getting their commercial research laboratory going. And when Richard Nixon was finally president, he lost in 1960 to Kennedy. And after the two Kennedy brothers were killed, one of them in 1968, Robert Kennedy, running against Richard Nixon, then Nixon was home free with SPIRO AGNEW and he could set up these laboratories. The New York Times says they have done considerable contract work for the National Cancer Institute. So these people have their finger right into cancer, and what they've contributed we don't know about because there's more cancer and it seems more excruciating than ever. The article then says Litton has come under sharp criticism recently for its performance in shipbuilding contracts, but that doesn't matter. They're being questioned about their shipbuilding contracts and cost overruns. They still get $100 million for cancer work. Then this article concludes, the Fort Detrick was largely a secret facility while it was working on biological warfare research. It will now be open to scientists from the United States and abroad, including from the Soviet Union and mainland China. Well, I wonder how many of those have been allowed to be in there. The Cancer Institute's operations at Fort Detrick will be located primarily in a high-security area of the former biological warfare research facility, so that the work at Fort Detrick would proceed as of 1971 and 72, with Defense Department and Litton Industry going into viruses, immune system, and so forth. And just as I cited the Lawrence Livermore Lab working on AIDS, the Defense Department and the makers of, people working for the Defense Department, like the corporation in San Jose that has a pesticide called Command, while they're making tanks for the Defense Department, there's a close marriage between the Pentagon and the warfare state and those things that affect our biology and our health. Now, David Emory sent me an article that's from the San Francisco Chronicle, which I missed when it first came out, titled Variant of Virus Suspected in AIDS, a New Discovery. And he's had this on his program, and he's done a very conclusive and authoritative summary of the disease AIDS that's available from a company called Davcor. And I'll give you the information on that to follow it in a different sequence, but a lot of this material is very important for studying where we're going now and how many dangers there are to us now, and where did these things evolve, like I mentioned last week, coming out of Stanford University, because Stanford now is very much involved with the Pentagon with AIDS studies and breaking up the molecules and putting viruses in areas that cause bacteria that can spread and leave and go to mankind, getting out of the laboratory and very dangerous consequences. Now, this article from the San Francisco Chronicle, this is April 17, 1984. Researchers at the National Cancer Institute have located a variant of a cancer-associated virus from a group of AIDS patients. Now, this is the same National Cancer Institute that was using the facilities of biological and chemical warfare. The article says it may prove to be the cause of the epidemic in the gay community. Dr. Robert Gallo from Bethesda, Maryland, insisted it was premature to consider the virus as the agent that actually causes AIDS. The organism, which is the third known variant of the human T-cell leukemia virus, is being termed HTLV type 3. If the virus is the cause of AIDS, it should show up in high-risk people who have not yet shown signs of the disorder. The Gallo team discovered the first variant of the HTLV virus 4 years ago in 1980 in a line of cells cultured from the lymph nodes of a patient with cancer known as cutaneous, I can't pronounce the scientific words, cutaneous T-cell lymphoma. The same virus has been found in victims of lymphatic cancer in southwestern Japan, in several Caribbean islands, and I wonder in the Caribbean islands where, if this was the Bahamas, because that's where Dr. Herman Urban of the Gestapo, and he was a medical doctor, worked in the Bahamas as a part of a medical group, and he was the Gestapo chief in control of Errol Flynn. At the time, Flynn was acting with Ronald Reagan. And of course, Helene von Damm, Reagan's secretary, who was a translator for Otto von Bolschwing, the man who conceived of the final solution, she came to this country and worked in Chicago at the AMA and had medical connections before she went on to be secretary to Reagan in Sacramento for 8 years. This is all before she became ambassador from the United States to Austria. The article continues, a second variant of KTLV has since been isolated from a leukemia patient in culture at UCLA by David Gold. Both types of HTLV can transform normal cells into cancerous ones, but only in laboratory cultures. The term T cell comes from a specialized cell that form in the bone marrow and organize in the thymus gland. They are vital to the normal functioning of the human immune system, one of the major markers in the AIDS patients. Now, it's interesting that the discovery of the organism that is a factor in causing AIDS, the virus that's the cause of the AIDS, should be discovered through the facilities of the National Cancer Institute and a doctor working at Bethesda, Maryland, when Richard Nixon had turned over the facilities, along with SPIRO AGNEW, to Litton Industries, and a scientist from Stanford was the first person to break down the facility by which you split the DNA in order for the virus to enter, and this virus could cause the AIDS. Now, May the 8th, just this past month and a half ago, several newspapers carried this story. Scientists say the United States is losing costly war against cancer. Drugs underused on cancer patients. It's that they don't have enough chemotherapy. They're having what they decide is curable cancers that could be relieved, but cancer patients are being lost, and the cancer death statistics are tremendous. And this article cites cancer death and the National Center Institute's Division of Cancer Prevention and Control, citing that if there was a war on cancer, we're losing it. The Washington Post also had a story May the 8th, U.S. seen as losing their fight with cancer. April 21st this year, there was an article, AIDS vaccine treatment in sight, researcher says. And this is Dr. Robert Gallo from Bethesda, Maryland, the same Gallo that was working there with the AIDS experiments that were cited. He says American scientists have made tremendous progress towards finding a vaccine and life-saving treatment for AIDS, which I seriously doubt that they found a treatment. If they had the treatment, they wouldn't say it was so far off. And Dr. Robert Gallo is being quoted as not only finding the virus that causes AIDS, but he's saying we will have a treatment. But then he goes on to say, one less hopeful side, Gallo worried, it may be too late to thwart the treatment of AIDS in Central Africa, where the deadly syndrome is believed to have begun. I'm not that optimistic about Central Africa. It's too widespread there. It would take more than a Marshall Plan to stop it. I think it's too late for them. Now, as I say, Reinhard Gehlen was brought here by Alan Dulles to form our Central Intelligence Agency, our National Security Council. In the book Gehlen Spy of the Century, he talks about wiping out in the Ukraine a population of approximately 40 million people within a week of when the war is over. Is Dr. Gallo talking about AIDS, saying it's too late for all the blacks in Africa? We see it now in Uganda. We see it in the Central Africa. Are all the blacks in Africa, including this is a good section of heterosexuals, dying of Africa? He says it's too late to thwart AIDS in Central Africa. He specifically says, but it's in the northern part too. And he's not optimistic. He said, I think it's too late for them. Is that the death sentence for millions of people who in Africa are dying of either starvation or AIDS? Is that the genocide in front of us, the medical genocide, the acceptance of that genocide by, here's a doctor who thinks he has control and treatment in sight, but is saying it's too late for the blacks in Africa who, as I say, are either starving or dying of AIDS. And what do we do? Just wipe them off? He goes on to say, the top officials, the article goes on to say, all AIDS funds now fall into a single budget under the control of an AIDS czar. Dr. Walter Dowdle, D-O-W-D-L-E, a former official with the Center for Disease Control, has been called the czar of AIDS, so that all money that fights AIDS will go to him and he will decide how it goes. And yet, at the same time, as of April 21st, 1986, Dr. Robert Gallo is literally telling you that large masses of the population are going to die. We'll have a cure, but they are going to die. Another article in the San Jose Mercury, cancer's other trigger. Researchers may have aided the disease formation, the study says. And this is cancer researchers seeking to observe the genetic trigger that causes normal cells to grow into tumors may have unwittingly pulled the trigger themselves by the way they conducted their experiments, which means in doing your work to stop it, you've given the disease. The findings question recent studies that suggest that cancer may be caused by minute chemical changes in normal genes. The study by Peter Duisberg, a UC professor of molecular biology, and Klaus Cichutek, Cichutek, a UC postdoctoral researcher, was published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science. Recent cancer research has suggested that single chemical changes in sections of the genes called point mutations cause cells to begin to form tumors. And this is exactly the kind of thing that was being done in 1971 at Stanford at the time period that Richard Nixon gives the laboratory over to Litton Industries. And that early time period in 1971, cells were being discovered that could form into tumors. The article says, rather, the cell becomes cancerous when a certain section of the gene is removed, like a broomstick with a certain section cut from it. And that section is the precise location where previous researchers chemically snipped the gene to study the point mutations found below what he believes may be the key cancer-sensitive area. What we think is that it's the truncated area that is the part that transforms the gene. Genes are microscopic portions of hereditary DNA molecules carried in chromosomes that contain the biological blueprint which tells each cell in the body what it is and what it does. This allows each cell to reproduce itself perfectly when it is needed, unless the gene is changed. Unless the gene is oncogene, ONCOGENE, which contains information that causes the cell to reproduce endlessly and chaotically, forming tumors. And in splitting these genes, the DNA, and perfecting this at Stanford, then moving these experiments, among other places, to a building and on a compound of 1,200 acres to be located where the biological chemical warfare is located at a time where Nixon and AGNEW are referring to people in the United States as being a disease, using the term disease, and the study of cancer was put in the hands, literally, of the military, and it can be a military weapon for silencing large hunks of the population. Now, the Washington Post had a story April the 7th, Nixon and the Cancer Cure. This is now 1986. The other 1971 is when he turned the laboratory over to Litton Industry. When Richard Nixon signed the National Cancer Act into law 2 days before Christmas in 1971, he said, I hope in the years ahead we'll be able to look back and see this action was the most important action taken by this administration. Even if history one day decides that to be the case, Nixon wasn't quite ready on Saturday to declare victory into what he wanted to be known as the war on cancer. In a rare Washington appearance, Nixon spoke to 250 delegates to the 12th National Meeting of the Association of Community Cancer Centers at the Hyatt Regency. After receiving his award for service to cancer patients, he said, the bad news is that we hope to find a cure. We have not. We also found that the death rate of cancer has actually increased. He gets an award in 1986 and then tells them, whoops, we have more cancer than ever. Here we put this $100 million in 1971. What have we got here? He said the good news is for the past 15 years that a 40% increase in survival rates and so forth. He says, I understand that most scientists believe that cancer is caused by defects in certain genes. And as a result of this research, since this act was passed on, we find the oncogenes as being identified. We don't have a cure yet, and if we find a cause, the cure will come. So in 1971, he was starting this activity for cancer. Now, interestingly enough, Elmer Bobst, who Richard Nixon calls Pops, or Mr. Pop, is literally like his godfather. Nixon has no father, had no father for many, many years. And Elmer Bobst is the owner of Warner Lambert, the pharmaceutical concern. and Warner Lambert and all these concerns make quite a bit of money off of the disease cancer and all the areas related to cancer. And Lambert was the person that worked with and gave it bona fides to Otto von Bolschwing. Again, the Eichmann superior, the man who thought of the final solution, and through the corporation TCI, von Bolschwing worked with Warner Lambert, among other people, and with Helene von Damm. So the American Medical Association and the idea for cancer as part of the thinking of these particular people must be understood in the effect they've had and what is coming out now, like this terrible epidemic, like a plague, coming out of the society called AIDS. And Warner Lambert, the first thing he did after World War II, when he became the first civilian director of the American Cancer Society, and it used to be doctors, was put William Donovan of the OSS on the board of the Cancer Society, and Donovan has treated people like they were diseases or things to be done away with. Donovan of the OSS and CIA, who very early spoke about the necessity for biological warfare and chemical warfare and using biology as a weapon and so forth. So the career of Richard Nixon is closely tied to Warner Lambert and Elmer Bobst, and to the AMA and to the intelligence community, the OSS and the CIA, with their activities into diseases, so that today when we have an epidemic of AIDS that affects so many people, artists and designers and people in the theater and so forth, it's affecting such a good hunk and selection of our community. And Richard Nixon was very early into setting up the chemical biological warfare studies with the Defense Department, because that's what LITTON is. It is the Defense Department, and working with Elmer Bobst. So as the years passed and we go back to 1971 in the social milieu there, here is Richard Nixon talking about cancer. Now the article continues, citing progress in cancer treatment and prevention. He told how Rosemary Woods, his longtime secretary, who was in the audience the day of the luncheon, underwent surgery for lung cancer this winter. She had a very rugged time, but on the other hand, she's here today. If she had not gone to the doctor, if he hadn't insisted on the operation, she would not be here today. So it turns out that Rosemary Woods, the secretary who typed the 18 minutes that later were missing, that could have really processed the full impeachment of Richard Nixon, she's dying of cancer. Then he said his younger brother, Donald Nixon, has been undergoing chemotherapy for Hodgkin's disease. They saw each other 3 weeks ago. Well, Donald Nixon worked with Johnny Meyer in the Howard Hughes organization, and he was a pain in the neck to Richard Nixon and the powers that be. And he was followed. Johnny Meyer was followed, and he worked full employee for the Howard Hughes organization, and Donald Nixon worked along with him. So another Watergator is who had very important connections at the time between Howard Hughes and the Nixon administration. His younger brother has cancer, and his secretary has cancer. And then he concludes, this articles conclude in the Washington Post by saying, the way Nixon remembered 1971, it had been a banner year for his administration. In July 71, he announced his trip to China. He announced his trip to Russia, and we had reduced American casualties. But now, in the light of all those achievements, how could I say that the action of signing the National Cancer Act wasn't the most important achievement of our administration? That China and Russia were nothing, that the National Cancer Act was important, and turning over the German biological warfare units to Cancer Institute was the important part of administration. And then there was an article just June 19th, 1986, in the Monterey Herald, and it had to do with the Mervyn Field poll. I guess you saw it. People's Choice for Foreign Relations Job. Richard Nixon's the one. Richard Nixon so popular, the popular choice. Poll taken. It's a small poll, California poll taken in May. How much people love Richard Nixon more than Jimmy Carter or Gerald Ford. And then it concludes by saying that Nixon was giving a speech at the World Affairs Council in Los Angeles, and there was standing room only at the audience for the World Affairs Council. Well, at World Affairs Council, the president at one time was Roy Ash of Litton Industries, and the same man who was working with Nixon on the cancer aspect. And the funny thing is that my father was the only Jewish president of World Affairs Council I believe they ever had. And when he was quite old when he was president, and he stepped down, he didn't want it another year, and he recommended Roy Ash of Litton Industries become president of the World Affairs Council. My father never had any inkling of what these people did. He knew what I was studying, but he wasn't particularly interested. And it's really funny, the cycle of Roy Ash being one of the former presidents of the World Affairs Council. And here is Richard Nixon making his survival speech, lauding his work, with his cancer in 1971-72, and they're telling how popular he is. And all of these people were linked to the Defense Department, and cancer has been a very effective weapon to eliminate a lot of people that knew information on political assassinations, that interfered with government activity. And Martha Mitchell was the most horrendous example. The injection she had in California, and then shortly, a few years later, died of a terrible kind of cancer with multiple myeloma, which has symptoms almost identical to AIDS, but they didn't call it AIDS in those days. She kept falling and breaking her bones. They called it a blood cell disease, multiple myeloma, and it could have come right out of the laboratories that Litton and Richard Nixon and Elmer Bobst and the powers that be were making as a political weapon for people such as Big Mouth Martha, who was talking about the administration and their various crimes. Well, so much for that, and the medicine for this week and for last week. We could do one program a week on medicine as a weapon, but that's all for right now, and the hour's up. This is Mae Brussell, and I'll be back with you next week to update some other important stories in the news, and take care. And again, thank you for the books and articles, and I'll keep in touch during the week, in the weeks to come. Bye-bye, and thanks for patience for my not answering mail so soon. It's really difficult. I hope you understand.